Okay, and welcome. So this week we're going to be doing pronunciation again, and this week we're going to be doing eliding and deleting. You remember that last week we spoke about assimilation, the idea of assimilating sounds rather than people to become Borg robots or cyborgs flying across the galaxy in a weird cube. This is the idea of about how sounds come out, how sounds are absorbed or affected by other sounds nearby them. Okay, now before we move into eliding and deleting, which is related to last week's topic of assimilation, let's look at the homework that I gave you. What I asked you to do was to look at this passage which I prepared for you, to think about the way that the sounds become assimilated when you're reading it. Now, it's not just an individual sound, and it's not necessarily just a syllable in a word. It's about entire words, especially the small words that go between the bits of the narrative. So Joe and bakery, these are key words. Jackie, Finland. So these are important words. Helsinki. But in between, you've got the prepositions or the pronouns and things like that, relatively small words, which when you listen to the way that we actually say a sentence of a passage like this, that when we are making an effort to sound as natural as we can, we tend to diminish somehow. We assimilate the sound. So what I've done is I've asked my colleague who also speaks British English, and by the way, I speak British English. I don't speak Australian English, although I do live in Australia, and I lived for many years in Brazil. My accent is British accent. Now, I don't make excuses for that. I continue not to make excuses for that. But what we will be doing over time is perhaps developing slightly different activities so people can compare. It shouldn't be your aspiration to talk like me, nor should it be your aspiration to talk like necessarily like any native speaker. What we're focusing on in this suite of pronunciation lectures is the way of speaking well, okay? So it's not, oh, I really need to speak just like Her Majesty the Queen. No, that shouldn't be what you're aiming for. You need to speak clearly, you need to speak well. You need to make sure that your pronunciation is not detrimental to your overall comprehension, or the comprehension rather of the people who are listening to you. So let's have a look then. I've highlighted in red those words which are, well, as far as the process of diminishing or assimilating sounds are concerned, the words in red are the words that are going to be diminished. Okay, the words in black you will hear undiminished, but the words in red will be rather diminished. I'm going to play my colleague, who I recorded a little bit earlier, reading this passage. Read along, listen along, and focus your eyes on the red words as you're going, as she is going through the passage. Okay, so ready?
Joe and I went off to the bakery to buy 8 loaves of freshly baked bread. Joe had had a bad day and had been thinking about leaving Jackie, his girlfriend of 7 years, since they had been fighting a lot, on and off, for months. They were going to get married a while back, but she got offered a job in Finland and is about to move to Helsinki. Since Joe's not a fan of cold weather, he put his foot down and called the wedding off. I'd hoped that a walk to the shops to buy bread would have helped to cheer him up.
Okay. So that's the passage, and as you see, as you hear, there are those words which are sort of suppressed slightly, and there are those other words which come out more clearly. Another example, by the way, I've just noticed a word which we didn't put into red, but which was naturally diminished by the speaker, and that's the word since, as in before the word Joe. Since Joe's not a fan of cold weather, he put his foot down and called the wedding off. So the and, a, of, is. These words get diminished. This is a natural pattern of speech. It is an unnatural pattern of speech to say, since Joe is not a fan of cold weather, he had put his foot down. So that's the weirdness that we're trying to confront. That's how we want to overcome, if you like, the slightly robotic that pattern that people may adopt, especially in one of the tests. There is something called reading aloud. If you have to do that task, the reading aloud task, and you're sounding robotic, it will affect your score in a negative way. You want your scores, of course, to be as high as they possibly can be. So you need to absorb these methods. So moving on, eliding, deleting, or assimilating when you speak English is about sounding natural. That's why we're giving this 2 weeks. I need to emphasize this because I think some people feel this is trying to make me absorb bad habits so that when I actually do my speaking, I'm going to sound weirdly forced, a little bit contrived, a little bit like the way that somebody who speaks English as a first language, when they say a word in French, like Champs-Élysées, they put on a French accent. So they're talking normally and then they say, anyway, my friend and I went to the Champs-Élysées, and it's a bit weird when people do that. That's not the case here. I'm not, as I say, I need to emphasize this every week. I'm not concerned that you have a different accent from me. That's fine. What you do need to do is sound natural when you're speaking. So if you're interacting with an interlocutor, if you're speaking with a human being examiner in front of you, if you're talking to the algorithm, the naturalness of your tone is absolutely important. The robotic style of a 1950s science fiction robot, like this one from Return from the Forbidden Planet, that sort of electronic sound, that style is what you really need to avoid. Some people try and adopt that tone to maximize in their minds to maximize their score because they're thinking, I'm not making any mistakes. So if I do this, it's a dependable thing to do. Not at all. Okay, you sound weird, you sound robotic, strange. Now, if you want to sound like a robot, sound like this guy from AI. That's Jude Law's Gigolo character. I've forgotten the robot's name. He was a robot, but he was a futuristic robot who was handsome, actually spoke normally. You need to adopt a normal tone. Use the guy on the right rather than the robot on the left. So, moving on. Anyone know who Francis Scott Key was? I can say was, he's long dead. Anyone heard of Francis Scott Key? If you've heard of Francis Scott Key, good for you. If you haven't, it doesn't really make any difference. Oh, I see somebody has. Francis Scott Key, who was he? He wrote the Star-Spangled Banner in 1814. Star-Spangled Banner is the US national anthem. Although it's only officially been the anthem for about 100 years or less, it was written 200 years ago, over 200 years ago, during the war between Britain and the United States. The British bombed, I don't know, the coast of Maryland or something like that, and he wrote this inspiring song. Now, he didn't write the tune. Da, 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 da. If you're familiar with the tune, that's a drinking song. I don't know if you knew that. The drinking song was an English drinking song from the 1700s, from the 18th century. That was the tune. Francis Scott Key, he wrote the lyrics. When he wrote the lyrics, he did what many people who write lyrics and write poetry do, and he used elision. Okay? Francis Scott Key, the author, the man who penned the American national anthem, used elision. So here's a couple of examples of what he did. O'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. O'er. That's not a common word that you see in modern English. And o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. These are two examples of what Francis Scott Key did when he wrote the American national anthem using elision. Over the ramparts and over the land. Okay? So the word isn't it's over. But you'll notice that is one syllable. Over is two syllables. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer, but he wrote this piece of poetry, and he realized it needed to scan. He couldn't use two syllables, he needed only one. He needed a preposition, and he needed that one because the flag waves over the land. So this is referred to sometimes as poetic license. What is poetic license? It's license or liberty taken by a poet, prose writer, or another artist in deviating from rule, conventional form, logic, or fact, in order to produce a desired effect. That I took out from a definitions website. In other words, what is poetic license? Basically, making the words fit, okay? A poet, a songwriter, whether it's from the olden times or from modern times, you're writing words, you're writing lyrics, you want them to fit, you might take poetic license. That might mean writing instead of over. Everyone understands what it is, but he wrote with an apostrophe. Okay? Poetic license means making the words fit. Now, here's a task for you, your first task of today. What are the full versions of these words? These are words that you will often see using this idea of poetic license. Feel free to have a little think, read those words aloud to yourself and think there are 4 words there. What should they be if they were the full versions? Some of you are answering, thank you. I'll read them to you. Ne'er, t'other, tis, and cap'n. So, the answers, thank you for those of you who did supply me with them. Ne'er is in fact never. T'other is the other. Tis, it is, and cap'n is captain. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen any of those shortened versions of the words before, but they do exist. They exist in poetry, they exist in songs, they have been used, they are out there, all right? But they're not common to see in your day-to-day. You wouldn't receive an email from somebody, ne'er before have I been so upset. It's a bit weird, all right? So, never, the other, it is, and captain. And now I'm going to give you 2 other examples of elision, which is also used as poetic license. So we've got an example from Edgar Allan Poe, who was an American writer of the 19th century, and we've got William Shakespeare, who was an English writer from the 17th century, or 16th, 17th century. We start with Shakespeare, it's interesting. But with thy brawls, thou hast disturbed our sport. It's interesting to note, Shakespeare was, of course, writing in that form of early modern or sort of middle English. So you've got thy and thou. You have hast as a conjugation, as in had, and disturbed. Now, presumably at the time, disturbed was pronounced disturbed, a 3-syllable word. Disturbed is what we would say nowadays normally, disturbed with an ED, but he used a contraction, this elision, in order to make it sound right. So what Shakespeare did, we've now taken on full time. And then Edgar Allan Poe, writing a form of poetry, "'Tis some visitor I muttered, tapping at my chapter door, only this and nothing more, 'tis," rather than "it is some visitor." For scanning purposes, 1 syllable rather than 2. All right, people do this all the time. They've done it for many years. This is quite common to do. We do this in poetry, we do this in songs for a particular reason, because it scans well. So the question you may ask is, well, is it only playwrights and poets who need to know about this? This idea of elision, why are you confusing this with another term? It's very complicated. I've got enough on my plate without learning about elision and deletion and assimilation. Is it only them? Well, no. When I say everyone, I mean literally everyone, like everyone in Springfield has to. Everyone in the world who speaks English needs to know about this, because this is how we communicate. This is absolutely normal in terms of communication. Speaking of everyone, how many syllables are in the word everyone? Now, I've said the word about 4 times. Is it 2, 3, or 4 syllables? Is it everyone, or is it everyone? If you went for the second option, good for you, it is everyone. I don't think anybody would say everyone. In some of the things that we're going to see today, you might see, and we'll come and we'll talk about it, but you might see that there are examples of words where there is some disagreement. A good example is the word secretary. Secretary. The man or woman who receives people might be like a receptionist, but somebody who helps another person, their assistant, is sometimes referred to as the secretary. In the United States, in politics, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Education. Secretary, some people say, I say secretary. So there are some cases of where we elide in one part of the world and we don't elide in another. Those examples are relatively small numbers. They do happen, but just to be aware, there isn't constant 100% convergence or agreement on when we elide and when we don't. So here's a task for you, your second task. I'd like you to look at this list of words. You don't need to write anything. Just look at this list of words and decide how many syllables are in each of those words, okay? Remember, we talked about syllables some weeks ago. Count it as you say them. It's going to help you. Read them aloud. Decide how many syllables there are. Okay, I hope you had a chance to say these at least aloud to yourselves. We're going to come through and look at the next slide with them on, and then we'll see the answers. Notice, comfortable is 3 syllables. It is not comfortable, it's comfortable. 3 syllables. Memory, 2. Memory. There's an O, it vanishes. It's elided away. Memory. Temperature. Temperature, 3 syllables. Not temperature, temperature. If anyone is familiar with the character Yogi Bear, there was a terrible, terrible film made of Yogi Bear a few years ago with Dan Aykroyd doing the voicing. Yogi Bear, the cartoon character from, I think, from the 70s, had a singular way of saying things, and he would always add these sort of these extra syllables. So he would say temperature, a picnic basket, he would say. He would say vegetable, but it is not a vegetable, it's vegetable. Vegetable is 3 syllables. Now, the next word is an example of where you do hear people doing 2 or 3. I say temporary, temporary is 2 syllables. But some people say temporary, temporary. So temporary is 3 syllables, temporary is 2 syllables. If you said 2, if you said 3, that's both fine. Insufferable, insufferable is 4 syllables. Chocolate is not chocolate, unless you're Yogi Bear. Favorite is not favorite, it's favorite, favorite, favorite. And library, rather than library. Library is library, okay? We did talk in the past about Wednesday and February, but there you have it. Simply, the temptation to put in the syllables that you see and say the syllables that you think are there or that you think you've heard is a little bit of a mistake, all right? Listen to how people produce language, imitate that, not the accent, syllable count, word patterns, word stress. That's what the important thing is, all right? So the sounds that we eliminate when we speak are down to elision, deletion, and assimilation. So it's the sounds we eliminate for all sorts of reasons. If you're a poet, it's because it doesn't work scanning-wise. If you're just speaking, it's just too complicated. Who says iced coffee? Who says iced cream? We don't even write iced cream anymore, but when it was originally invented, people said iced cream, cream that had been iced. In fact, we now just say ice cream, because even if it was written with a D, we wouldn't pronounce the D, we would elide the D. The same with tea, iced tea. Remember what we said about a D followed by a T last week? Iced tea. Now, I don't know if the singer, songwriter, actor is iced tea or iced tea, but nevertheless, either way, we just say it the same way, iced tea, the angry one from the police drama, iced tea. So, moving on, in a similar vein, we're going to move to contractions. I've mentioned the word contraction already in today's lecture. What is a contraction? Well, the first idea of a contraction is a woman who's about to give birth to her baby. She suffers with contractions. She sits going, ah, 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 and then all of a sudden the miracle of birth happens. That's one idea of a contraction, meaning a muscular contraction. So that, in language, is what a contraction is. The what apostrophe S, that is a contraction. It's a shortened version of the written and spoken forms of a word, syllable, or word group created by omission of internal letters and sounds. Again, I've taken that very wordy, complicated explanation. It's absolutely correct. In other words, basically, it's an apostrophe word. Okay, when you get those words with apostrophe words, not, by the way, the possessive apostrophe, which is another issue I hope my colleague will deal with you, the apostrophe words which we use when we form contracted words. So let's have a look at this. When do we use them? First of all, we use them all the time in spoken English. If somebody's having a conversation, even in a relatively formal context, when people are talking, they will use contractions. It's absolutely normal to do so because it's a spoken English thing. Second thing, we use them quite a bit in emails and informal written contexts. I don't know how you are when you text. If you text a lot in English, I can't really get into text writing. I've got a whole keyboard. I use the whole keyboard. I use predictive texting, and I will use properly written words, but I will also use contractions, don't, won't, I've, and so on. So we will use that in emails, we use it in informal written context, and it is acceptable and expected in those contexts. However, we almost never use contractions in formal or written English. It is very important that you understand this. This lecture is about pronunciation, meaning the way that we speak. It is not about the way that you write. You do know how to use them. You do know how to write those words when you're actually transcribing what somebody has said, but please, please, please make sure that you're using them in the right way, in the right context, all right? Don't use them when you're writing your essay in your exam. It's not going to come across well at all. So, another task for you. All of these can be orthographically contracted. Now, what do I mean by orthographically? Spelling-wise, your spell checker will not go all wobbly lined underneath them if you write them when you're preparing a Word document. So what I'd like you to do is look at them. They are uncontracted. I'd like you to say them aloud as contractions. Go through the list one by one. He is becomes, you probably work it out. Go through the list, read them aloud to yourselves, and then we'll look together in a minute. Okay, fantastic. Let's have a look then. So he is becomes he's. Shall not becomes shan't. Shan't. It's less common to hear shan't nowadays than in the past. A little bit like we hear less the word shall than the word will. It's kind of been taken over a little bit in that sense. But shan't we especially use with question tags, okay? Shan't we, shall we, and shan't we. We'll often use comma and then the question tag. Shall we, shan't we? Will not becomes won't. They are becomes there. We are becomes we're. We would he would becomes he'd. She will becomes she'll. Ought not becomes oughtn't. Oughtn't, 2 syllables. Oughtn't. I know the other one's 2 syllables too, but oughtn't. And she has becomes she's. Now, notice the first one is she, he's, and the last one is she's. One of the reasons I topped and tailed with those two is because a lot of people get confused. They say, it's the same contraction. How do I know if it's meant to be she has or she is? Well, context is everything. So if the sentence is a present perfect sentence, that would lead you to draw the conclusion that she's been out all night. She has been, okay? She's an American. She is an American. Not she has an American. You wouldn't say she has an American unless, I don't know, maybe there is one sitting next to her in her possession. So those are the contracted forms, and we commonly use them, as I say, in the spoken sense or in the less formal written sense. So they're the contractions. I hope you got those. Then we also have some other common contractions, and these contractions are not considered quote unquote good spelling. There is something to be said for good spelling and bad spelling. So what I'd like you to do is look at these words, some of which will be familiar to you, especially through your familiarity with words or lyrics or songs. I'd like you to say them aloud and then decide how they might be written, okay? How would these words be written properly? Thanks for some of your responses here, that's good. I'll read them aloud to you, and forgive me because I'm just going to read them as I would say them. Gonna, wanna, betcha, kinda, lemmy, dunno, ain't, in it. Okay? Gonna, going to, wanna, want to. Betcha, bet you. Kinda means kind of. That's, by the way, that's a very common filler. Kinda is one of those, remember we were talking about those nervous fillers, those things that you say when you can't think of what you're meant to say next. Instead of saying ah, or you might say kinda, kinda. Lemme is let me, dunno, do not know, ain't. I don't know if you've heard ain't before. If you haven't heard ain't before, welcome. Welcome to the word ain't. People use it quite a lot. And it's not just North America, or it's used all over the world. Ain't could be are not, am not, is not, have not. There's all sorts of ways that ain't is used. So I ain't going is I'm not going. He ain't going, he's not going. I ain't done nothing, terrible structure, but that's what a native speaker might say. I ain't done nothing, I have not done anything. Okay, so we will hear that all the time. You will hear these contractions, you will hear them used, and you will often say, that doesn't make grammatical sense. Well, sorry about that. That's the kind of thing you're going to confront. Now, what you do after your exam, what do you do once you've moved to Canada or America or Britain or Australia, wherever it might be, when you start misusing English all over the place, there's nothing we can do about that. Just be aware. I'm telling you about these things so you are aware of them, so you know where they come from and why we do these things. We do these things to make language easier to pronounce. We make language easier to say. We now say disturbed rather than disturbed because over the course of several hundred years, we realized that adding an extra syllable was just too annoying. Disturbed. All right. In it is isn't it. The last one is very English, and it's especially very Southern English. If you ever watch a Guy Ritchie film, if anyone's seen Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, or if you've seen any of those Cockney gangster films, they say in it all the time. Again, like a question tag, but it's used quite commonly. In it, isn't it, is it not, is the correct form, but it's used a great deal. All right? Now, let me repeat my health warning with a skull and crossbones and a big danger sign. Please, eliding, deleting, and assimilating is important for your speaking. It is not important for your writing. Please, don't confuse what we're talking about in relation to the way that we speak, the way that we pronounce sounds, to the way that you actually sit down and prepare an essay about geological formations in southern China. Okay, if you're preparing for the academic IELTS, don't be doing this. If you're preparing for the PTE academic, please learn how to write formally and do it correctly. Don't be doing any of what we're talking about. The elision is about the way that we say words. So I've written down this a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Whatever you do, don't think about writing an essay like this in your exam, yeah? Okay, so the way that you might say in conversation is not the way that you would actually write in reality. Okay, so writing here, speaking here. Sound natural, don't sound common. So a little bit of homework for you. What I'd like to do is the following. I'm assuming most of you like songs. It doesn't have to be the latest songs. It could be songs, any songs that you particularly like. So a good example is Girls Just Wanna Have Fun from a million years ago by Cyndi Lauper. Wanna is in the title. They want to. No, they wanna have fun. Go to a good lyrics website. There are many. I won't recommend a single one. There are plenty of them around. Find the lyrics for 3 songs that you like and find examples of elision, deletion, or assimilation, what we might also call poetic license. Find examples of that and then have that ready just as an example of what it is that somebody that you admire or somebody that you like has done. And it could be, as I say, something old, it can be something new. You will find it all the time. It is very interesting. The way that we do, the way that we use language, the way that we manipulate the language to make sure that what we're doing comes across in a way that scans nicely, nice for the ear. And another thing I just wanted to mention, I previously mentioned a film, and I was quite pleased when I heard that somebody had seen the film that I suggested. This author, Bill Bryson, I mention him because he's a really interesting writer. If somebody's interested in going a little bit more in detail about the English language, these 2 books are very, very useful. Mother Tongue, actually, I think was written first. It's about a general history of the English language, but it's written in a very, very entertaining way. If you're inspired and you want to look a bit more detail about English and go beyond your exam, Bill Bryson's Mother Tongue is an excellent place to start. You can also see either after reading mother tongue or instead of reading mother tongue, or as well as Made in America by the same author, Bill Bryson. Bill Bryson is uniquely interesting because he's an American who moved to the United Kingdom and moved back to America and then moved back to the UK. Very, very interesting writer. He's written many, many books. If some of you are considering moving to Australia, you might want to read his book about Australia, which is very, very nice. I think it was his first travel book. But Bill Bryson is my recommendation of the week. So please have a look at that and let me know how you get on. And as usual, please do upgrade. Join us on the website if you haven't decided to pay for our material already. We'd be very happy to have you. And I will look forward to seeing you next week for another installment of the pronunciation lectures. Okay? Meanwhile, stay with me if you're live.